We're going to talk about the inyan of standing when the Aron Kodesh is open. The reason we're talking about it today is it was today's Daf Yomi. Sort of. Not exactly. There is no real halacha in Shas that you have to stand when the Aron Kodesh is open, but there is such a halacha that you have to stand for a Sefer Torah, and that comes up in today's Daf Yomi, so I thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about that topic. The Gemara in Maseches Makos on Daf, and this year should be l'zchus for Shlomo Tzvi Ben Chaim, who's having surgery today, so the zchus for our learning should be for Shalema. So the Gemara in Maseches Makos tells us that the din of standing in front of a Sefer Torah is compared to the din of standing for a Talmud Chacham. The way that the Gemara expresses that comparison is by mocking the Babylonian people. Kama tipshim hema bavlim, how foolish are Kama tipshai hani bavloi, the Gemara says, how foolish are these Babylonians that they stand mipnei Sefer Torah, they stand, and mipnei Talmidei Chachamim who are lomei Torah, they don't stand. That how ridiculous that is, that they stand for a Sefer Torah, but they don't stand for Talmidei Chachamim. The Gemara in Kiddushin, so the implication of that Gemara, therefore, is that it's foolish to think that there's more of an inyan to stand for a Sefer Torah than there is for a Talmud Chacham. Adrabah, there's more of an inyan to stand for a Talmud Chacham than there is for a Sefer Torah. The problem is that there's Gemara in Kiddushin Daf Lamed Gimel that asks, what's the halacha about standing for a Sefer Torah? The Gemara says that Rabbi Chilka, Rabbi Simon, Rabbi Lazar, it's a kal v'chomer. Mipnei lomdeha omdim, mipaneha lo kol shkein. That if you stand for those who learn Torah, then kal v'chomer, you should stand for the Torah itself, which implies that the Torah itself is the greater mechayiv, meaning in order to make a kal v'chomer, you need a kal and you need a chamur. So the clear implication is that it's a greater mechayiv to stand for the Sefer Torah itself, more so than the Talmud Chacham, the opposite of what the Gemara in Makos implies. So this kasha of the steer in the two sugyas is asked by the Ran in Maseches Kiddushin, the Tosfos in Maseches Kiddushin, the Tosfos Rosh in Maseches Kiddushin. They all ask this stira, and they all answer the following. The Tosfos, Tosfos Rosh, the Ran quotes in the name of Tosfos the following answer. There are many answers to this question, but let's focus on this one. That the din of Kavod Sefer Torah certainly is greater than the din of Kavod Talmidei Chachamim, like the Gemara in Kiddushin implies. That the Sefer Torah has a higher madrega than the Talmud Chacham. Why does the Gemara in Makos wonder how foolish the Babylonians are that that they stand for the Babylonians are so foolish that they stand for a Sefer Torah and not for a Talmud Chacham? Not so crazy. The Sefer Torah is a greater level of kavod than the Talmud Chacham. Why does the Gemara think it's so crazy? That's because whenever you learn a kal v'chomer, it's true, you have to identify one thing as the kal and one thing as the chomer. But that which is the kal is also the source. It's the basis upon which the chomer is derived. Meaning, how do I know that you stand for a Sefer Torah? Because the Torah says, "V'adarta pnei zaken," that you stand for a Talmud Chacham. So it's silly, it's tipshai, it's foolish to think that you should only stand for the Sefer Torah, because think for a second, where do you know the chiyuv to stand from a Sefer Torah? Yes, it's more of a chamer dika inyan, but where do you know it from? You only know it from the inyan of standing for a Talmud Chacham. That's why it's foolish. The difficulty with that explanation is that it doesn't really fit the hemshech of the Gemara Maseches Makos, because the Gemara goes on in Maseches Makos to say, and I'll tell you why Talmidei Chacham are more important than the Sefer Torah, because the Sefer Torah says Arba'im Yakenu, that you give someone 40 malchus, and what do the Chachamim come along and tell us? Not 40, 39. So you see that the Chum overrules, so to speak, the Pashup Pshat of the Torah. So it doesn't make it sound like it's about the source versus the Totzah, versus the Halacha that we're motzi from the source. It makes it sound like the Chachamim are taka more chashuv. But anyway, that's the approach of a wide variety of Rishonim. So based on this yesod, that the din of Kavod Sefer Torah is derived from the din of Kavod Talmidei Chachamim, the poskim, the Rishonim, the Achronim already point out that probably some of the gedarim of when you have to stand for a Sefer Torah should mimic those gedarim of when you stand for a Talmud Chacham. For example, the Pri Megadim in Orach Chaim Siman Kuf Mem Aleph, in the Mishpat Zav, which is the section that's his commentary on the Taz. Pri Megadim is a super commentary. Super commentary doesn't mean it's a really great commentary, it means it's a commentary on a commentary. Right? So Pri Megadim wrote on the Magen Avram and on the Taz. So he has Eshel Avram on the Magen Avram, Mishpatzol Zav on the Taz, on the Turei Zahav. So the Pri Megadim writes in the Mishpatzol Zav, Sivkat and Gimel over there, that the poskim derive a number of halachos. For example, just like there's a halacha by Talmud Chacham that you only have to stand from when he's moving. Talmud Chacham walks into a room and he just stops. Let's say Sachs were to walk into this room and stop here, so everyone would stand up as he walks in. He would stand here at the stender, and then what? Everyone would remain standing the whole time? No, you wouldn't remain standing the whole time. You would sit down. Once he's not moving, once he's at his place, everyone sits down. The same is true about a Sefer Torah. When a Sefer Torah arrives at its place, it's no longer moving, it's in its makom, it's just sitting still, you would no longer have to stand for the Sefer Torah. Similarly, but not exactly the same. The Rashba writes in a tshuva in Chelek Gimel, Siman Reish Pei Aleph, the Rashba was asked whether it's necessary to stand during Hagba. They lift up the Sefer Torah, it seems that everyone does stand. Is it really necessary to stand? Says the Rashba, not necessarily. They have to stand based on the idea of because the Hagba of the Sefer Torah is normally done on an elevated bima, which is in one location. The whole tzibur is in another location down from that elevation. Since they're in two different spots, so the Sefer Torah is sort of in its own separate makom, and therefore there's no requirement to stand for it at that time. However, he says, most places they have a minhag to stand for it because it's the covet of the Sefer Torah that as the Sefer Torah is being used to be shown to the Am, so the minhag is that they stand for it in most places. In Shulchan Aruch, Yardei Siman Reish Mem Beis Sif Yud Ches, Shulchan Aruch writes that let's say your Rebbe is called up to get an aliyah, you don't have to stand the whole entire aliyah. You stand as he walks up to go get the aliyah, but then you can sit down for the aliyah. And the Rama writes, and the same is true when the Rebbe is omed l'mala b'bayis v'talmid ala karka. If you're in two different reshuyos, the Rebbe is on some elevated surface, and the Talmud is down below, that it's not necessary to stand for the Rebbe in that situation. And Rama says, even if the Sefer Torah is not elevated, let's say the Sefer Torah is just on the bima, it's on a table from which you are reading from the Sefer Torah, that's good enough. It's not necessary to stand in that situation. So the Taz, the Sivkat Yud Gimel writes that even if the Sefer Torah is, the Taz points that out, that's what the Ramah is saying, that even if the Sefer Torah is not on an elevated bima, it's just on a table that itself is 10 tefachim high and 4 tefachim wide, that's a reshus b'fnei atzmo, and it would be unnecessary to stand from it. So it says the Pri Megadim in Orach Chaim over there, that the Rashba and the Ramah are actually saying that the Sefer Torah is in a reshus acheres. That's only if the Sefer Torah, the idea that you need the Sefer Torah to be in another reshus is only if the Sefer Torah is still moving. If the Sefer Torah is not moving, you don't need it to be another reshus. Meaning there are two separate heterim over here, says the Pri Megadim. One is if the Sefer Torah is in its spot, its location, its kavua spot, it's not moving. It is where it is, it's not moving anymore. That's one heter. The other heter is it's in a different spot than you are. It's in a different location than you are, even if it is moving. During Hagba, the Sefer Torah is moving, but it's up there on the bima and you're off the bima, so me'ikar adin, no requirement to stand. That's how the Pri Megadim explains. Two entirely separate heterim that you have. Now, Sharatzion quotes the Pri Megadim that you don't have to stand when the Chazan is holding the Sefer Torah, and you don't have to stand when the Aron opens up. Why would you not have to stand when the Aron opens up? Because the Sefer Torah is not moving. It's just sitting there in the Aron. And the Sharatzion says, however, the Olam is noeg to do a Hidur la Torah v'lamod, to show an extra level of respect for the Torah, to stand, and this is a direct citation of the Taz. The Taz says the same thing. Now, when we open up the Aron Kodesh, the minhag is, the Olam is noeg, that we stand when we open up the Aron Kodesh. The El Yerabba writes that at the time that they do Hagba, he thinks that it's an actual chiyuv to stand, because it's one thing if the Sefer Torah is moving and it's in a different reshus, you're right, there's no chiyuv to stand. But what if it's moving in that different reshus dafka for you? So if it's moving dafka to show it to you, laharosa la'am, so then you have a greater level of chiyuv klape that Sefer Torah, and then you would have to stand. So says Rav Moshe in Igros Moshe, Orchaim Chelekei Siman Lamed Ches Oz Daled. He quotes the Taz, this Taz, that when you open up the Aron Kodesh, there's a minute to stand. There's no chiyuv, but there's a minute to stand. Rav Moshe says, yeah, that's our minhag. Whenever we open up, let's say, for the Shir HaKavod on Shabbos, you're going to say Anim Zemiros, they open up, everyone stands. Avinu Malkeinu during Aser Simei Tshuva and Baitalios, and, certain tefillos in Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, and they open the Aron for all of Ne'ilah, so Psich of Ne'ilah sells for a lot of money or whatever, they open up for all of Ne'ilah, and the minhag is that people stand, even though for some people it's very challenging. People have back problems, people who are older, it could be a great challenge to stand. So Moshe is not sure. How important is it? Meaning, when we say that it's a minhag to stand, what does that mean? Sometimes you say it's a minhag, and minhag halacha. A minhag has the status of halacha. It's something that's an absolute, that you have to do it. And sometimes you say that they were noheg to treat it b'toras minhag, not to treat it b'toras halacha. So if Moshe is not sure, does this become with like a chiyuv, that they did this for chavivos and avas haTorah, or did they do it not as a chiyuv? Because adrabah, then it's not showing a chavivos haTorah if it becomes a chiyuv. The chavivos haTorah is shown when you're doing it voluntarily. So maybe the minhag was to be mahader, and that it should always just be a hidur, but not b'toras chiyuv. And the nafkamina would be how big of an imposition one must take upon himself to stand, or if let's say there's some reason that you dafka need to be sitting at the time that the Aron Kodesh is up. Let's say you're learning and you're middle learning with the chavrusa. Standing up is going to distract you. It's going to distract your chavrusa, and someone walks into the shul that you're learning, and just to open up the Aron Kodesh to count how many Sefer Torah, to make sure that the Sefer Torah is there. You have to stand in the middle of your learning, so it's a minhag to stand when the Aron Kodesh is open. But if it's a minhag b'toras chiyuv, then you would have to. If it's a minhag b'toras minhag, then you wouldn't have to when something else is being sacrificed. So many are makbid that you sit by Ashrei Yoshev Esecha. So they put away the Sefer Torah at the end of Kriyas HaTorah, and then you go right into Ashrei. But the guy is still, he can't figure out the Aron Kodesh. He's still figuring out the safe and the extra door. So he can't, things get stuck or whatever, and he's still messing around with the Aron Kodesh, and the Aron Kodesh is still open. So can you sit for Ashrei Yoshev Esecha? L'chora, it's talui on this issue. Rav Moshe says, though, if you have an elderly crowd and you want to be yotzi the minhag of opening the Aron Kodesh, let's say for Anim Zemiros or for Ne'ilah or for any of these things, but you don't want people to have to stand, there's an eitzah. Rav Moshe suggests an eitzah. It's somewhat of a strange eitzah, but he suggests maybe you could open the Aron Kodesh less than 3 tefachim. Leave it ajar less than 3 tefachim. Why? What does that do if it's less than 3 tefachim? Lavud. So since you have lavud, it's as if it's closed. Yeah, it's as if it's closed l'gabe the minhag to stand, but it's not as if it's closed l'gabe the minhag of opening the Aron Kodesh. I don't know why. I don't know why the lavud would work for the minhag, but not for that. I don't really understand why, but that's what Rav Moshe suggests as an eitzah. So at the end of the day, when they open up an Aron Kodesh, the whole tzibur stands. That's a proper minhag. That's what the Taz says, but it's not a requirement midoraisa. It would seem that the requirement to stand when the Sefer Torah is moving is a requirement midoraisa because it's derived from a pasuk in the Torah v'adarta pnei zaken, and the kal v'chomer from that mipanei omdim that mipnei lomdei omdim mipanei lo kol shkein, that if you stand for those who learn Torah, then for sure you should stand for the Torah itself. Okay.